In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd while in Minneapolis police custody, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker introduced new police reform legislation that deals with certification for police officers. Carolee McGrath spoke with State Representative Bud Williams of the 11th Hampden District to hear his thoughts on the bill and other police reform measures.
The Black and Latino caucus, we've been working with the governor for almost 8 or 9 months on what we call the POST, which is the Police Office Standard and Accreditation Committee. And that's pretty much what his focus is. That's what he's focusing on in terms of getting the legislation done. His feeling and thinking is that, about July 31st, everything should be done. So technically this has to be done by maybe the middle of July, just in case your vetoes overrides and that kind of stuff. So he's doing the sprint version, not the marathon.
What do you think of the components of the bill? Because I know it talks about like a 3-year renewal or certification for training. This would go in addition to any in-training that officers would have to do anyway. Is that correct?
Well, the in-training would be whatever, we don't have it's not a standard situation. Policing in this country isn't federalized, meaning that each police department pretty much does their own thing. So whatever standards and training that you would do at the local level will be done. He's talking about a certification and decertification for all police officers every 3 years.
Can you describe a little bit about what the decertification would look like?
If you're a licensed barber or a beautician or a nail salon or a lawyer or a real estate broker, you have a license. And when you have a license, if there's a certain allegations or charges that you've done something wrong, then you go before a board, and that board then would determine whether you should lose your license, have your license suspension, whatever it is. So we thought that would make sense for police officers. There's no certification or decertification in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So for example, police officer, I'm just using New Hampshire as an example, has problems in New Hampshire with his record of misdeeds. And then he comes down to Massachusetts. There's no way for us to check that. So they could have allegations in another state or another department actually, and come to whatever city and work for that department. For an example, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that was the officer had 18 violations, 18 misdeeds. So we think it's necessary. Every other professional group has some kind of certification and decertification.
You mentioned that this effort in particular, this bill is a sprint, but that really there's a marathon in the process. What else would you like to see as far as police reform?
A couple things we talk about: no knock warrants. We talk a lot about chokeholds. We talk a lot about intervention. In other words, if a police officer is part of an investigation and another police officer is doing something that is not professional, that the other officer has a obligation to intervene. If he doesn't intervene, he can be held liable. If you saw, for example, the last incident in Minnesota, which the cops were just looking and watching. We want to try to prevent that type of behavior. And the other thing, qualified immunity, you might hear people talk about this a lot. It gives officers not absolute immunity, but qualified immunity. In other words, from our perspective, they can, do something that's constitutional, not right, and violate someone's constitutional rights, and we think they should be liable for it. You have to pay a price, we feel, for doing something unprofessional.
Now, that is also something that's being talked about on the federal level. Certainly the Senate Democrats want that in the legislation that they're looking at. You mentioned having officers kind of watching somebody else doing something wrong. How would you address that? Because obviously that happens in these police situations, but it's happened in other cases that have nothing to do with police, in other jobs. I think of the case of Jerry Sandusky. That was a sexual predator case, but something similar to that had come up. How do you address that? That if you see something is wrong, you got to act?
Hey, if you see something, you say something. That's our philosophy, and certainly it's just the professional conduct. I mean, if you see an egregious act being done in front of you, a chokehold, someone with a knee in someone's throat for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and the man saying, "I can't breathe," and you just stand and you look, or you see a case where police is using excessive force or police brutality, and you don't say anything, you don't do anything, well, you're part of the problem. And I think you should be held accountable and liable. There's a code that police officers always said, they want individuals to cooperate within a lot of urban communities. And if you see something, say something. And that's the case. But a lot of individuals I've heard this say, well, Mr. Representative, if we say something, there's police officers who see things and they don't say anything. So it's a double standard. I think if we begin to police ourselves, then I think citizens will then start to cooperate a little more. They see the code of silence, the blue code of silence we always talk about, the brotherhood that one cop doesn't dime out another cop. That's not right. It's not good.
There's been many calls to defund the police. And when you look at Northampton, they just cut a big part of their budget, I think about $600,000 for Northampton PD. I think Minneapolis is actually considering, reimagining the police department, I think is something that they had talked about, dismantling it. But on the other side, you see situations, for example, in Chicago, you have a toddler that was killed over the weekend, teenagers, certainly in our own city, that the little girl who was kidnapped and the police officers worked with the community to bring her back. Who suffers if you go to that extent of defunding police?
I was a probation officer for 36 years in Springfield District Court. I think I understand the criminal justice and law enforcement just as well as anyone. From my experience, I do not believe in defunding the police department. What I do believe in is reallocation. Now, we can reallocate money, and a lot of times our police officers are stressed because they're dealing with social issues, they're dealing with kids in school, they're dealing with they deal with every gamut of society. And what I really believe is that we can reallocate some of that funding and put more social service programs, prevention programs, intervention programs. And this is, again, an example of the Shannon Grant. Now, I am not a firm believer of a lot of money goes to a lot of community agencies, but a lot of that money in the Shannon Grant, which is a grant that the state gives to cities to work with police officers. I don't believe in a lot of that money should go to overtime.
And would you say that more mental health programs would be an appropriate allocation of that money?
Oh, absolutely. Mental health is, no one, with the pandemic and then with the race stuff going, no one's talking about mental health. What will happen once once the virus is put under control and you get a vaccine or you get something that can, work to tame the virus, that mental health aspect is really going to kick in. People being in isolation all the time, and police officers have a hard job. They have a tough job, but we just want to, when they do the job, do it professionally. I'm not trying to hamstring any police department, but I do know that reallocation of funds it will be very appropriate from my perspective.
And you bring up, the point that you have that law enforcement background, probation, certainly understanding that side of it. But if you see some of the dialogue, especially on social media, there seems to be this real, disagreement between people about police and, whether they're good guys or the bad guys. How do you avoid painting officers with a broad brush, and how do you heal that relationship? Because obviously, the men and women are still going out trying to do their job. How do you heal that relationship and rebuild the image?
See, this is an ongoing problem in America. It's not new. So what you're seeing is just a reaction for years and years and years. And I always talk about, Reconstruction, which was the first Reconstruction came after the Emancipation Proclamation, after slavery ended. And Black Americans were promised so much, 40 acres and a mule, better school systems, economic opportunities. That didn't happen. Fast forward, 64, Civil Rights Bill. That's the second Reconstruction. Same thing. And remember, the Kerner Commission was in 1968, I believe, after the Civil civil disobedience going on. And the Kerner Commission said it's a racism. So, another promises, civil rights, better housing, economic opportunities, jobs, better education, that didn't happen. So these are years and years and years of frustration. So now you have a buildup. And every time we get and most of the times, the only time something happens is when you have situations like this, civil rights, people protesting, Black Lives Matter. So that's the frustration of the community. It takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think we're in a better position in America, and race relations are a lot better than they were.
What can you say to young people who are experiencing this? There's a lot going on. And I think a lot of younger people, and maybe even people of all ages, don't have that same hope that you just expressed. How do we go forward?
We have to keep hope alive. We have to be realistic. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And certainly we're going to see some immediate changes right away. And then the rest of the dialogue is going to take time. It's going to take individuals sitting at the table and talking these things through. You got to talk these things through. They're hard. When you talk about race and you talk about color line, it's difficult. When you talk about racism, it's hard. It's hard when you look back how racist this country was in terms of the atrocities of slavery going way back. One of the first sins of this country was slavery, and it's hard, and so we're still dealing with that. But at least if we bring it to the forefront and sit down at the table of brotherhood, and we all talk about it, then we can resolve and get through this. First, acknowledging it, and I'm so happy. There's a lot of symbols are being taken down. General Lee, they're taking his statue down, and schools being named after these folks who were real racists, slave owners. Some of them were turned against America, turned against the country, and we honored them. People see the hypocrisy in this. So I just think, I tell young people, I talk to them on a daily basis. I know it's not going to happen overnight. I wish it happened overnight. I said the same thing you said when I was your age. But at least I think now, as I said, the discussion is broader. I think there are more individuals involved, and there are more good people who want to do the right thing.